Kia ora hu tātou katoa. Ko mamari te waka, ko te rarawa te iwi, ko te uri o hina te hapu, ko te uri o hina te marae. Ko te mea tutahi e mi ana ki te rungarawa, i o matua kore. He honore, he karoria ki tāna ingoa, he maungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. E mihi hoki ki tā tātou mate, o te rā, o te wiki, o te marama, o te tau. Ki tōku whaia tui, kua hinga i tērā atu tau. Ki tōku matua tā Vincent, kua hinga i tērā tau. O ki atu korua ki te wākainga, kia waiki nui, kia waiki roa, kia waiki pāmamau. E tai tōku ana te reo pōhiri, kia ora mo tō reo pōhiri Auntie Violet. Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou, e mihi ana ki o koutou rangatiratanga o te rohe nei. Te mihi nui ki te rangatira Ngunnawal, te rangatira o tēnei rohe. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora Helen mo tō reo pōhiri. Kia ora ko te mihi nunui ki tōku moko sinalei. Kua haerea ki roto, tangi ai. Engari, he tino koa hau nā tōna haerenga i te pōnei. In Māori, that's what we call a pepeha and a mihi mihi. Pepeha, introducing myself, saying that I'm from the Māori waka, the Māori canoe, the Te Rārawa iwi, the sub-tribe of Te Uri o Hina, and the marae of Te Uri o Hina, which are in the far north of New Zealand, a little to the west of Kaitaia, at the southern end of the 90-mile beach. I've acknowledged Io matua kore, Io the beginning, Io without parents, God in the Māori language. I've acknowledged Auntie Violet for her welcome here tonight, and acknowledged the Ngunnawal people as what we call the rangatira, the chiefs of this land. And I've acknowledged Helen's generous welcome to me tonight, and finally, and most importantly, my granddaughter Sinalei, who is 10 weeks old on Saturday, and this is her first academic event, and she's lasted a matter of minutes, but one day she may come back. Hoki mai anō e moko. Come back at some point. Anyway, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms that human rights belong to Indigenous persons and also to peoples. It confirms that colonial states, like Australia, have the right to govern, but it qualifies that right, qualifies it against the Indigenous right to self-determination, which is, in summary, the right to autonomy over their own affairs and to full and equal participation in the government of the state. Article 5 explains these complementary but different bodies of political capacity. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. The Declaration was adopted in 2007 by the UN General Assembly by a vote of 144 to 4. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States dissented. Like Canada, Australia believed that Indigenous rights were not inherent, but the subject of political negotiation. The United States argued that rather than refer to Indigenous peoples, the Declaration ought to address the rights of persons belonging to Indigenous groups, address them as individual rights of egalitarian justice, but as neither distinctive nor collective. Over time, these 4 states withdrew their objections, saying that they could accept the declaration as an aspirational instrument. Australian governments have not developed these aspirations in any substantive way, with the exception of Victoria's treaty, which passed Parliament last month and is grounded in the Declaration's assumption that culture and colonial experiences matter in public policy. The simple philosophy that government should work equally well for everyone and that everyone should have a say in deciding exactly what working well actually means is what the treaty intends to bring to life. The elected body, research and policy evaluation entity, and the truth-telling commission that the treaty establishes will sit outside Parliament, but in the treaty's words, become an important part of Victoria's democratic fabric. The Assembly will make an annual address to Parliament, meet regularly with Cabinet, with ministers, senior officials, and the Police Commissioner. It will be able to submit written questions to ministers at any time and contribute to decision-making on any matter it chooses. Every bill introduced into Parliament must include a statement of treaty compatibility, which must say whether, in the opinion of the minister introducing the bill, it is consistent with advancing the inherent rights and self-determination of First Peoples, addressing the unacceptable disadvantage inflicted on First Peoples by the historic wrongs and ongoing injustice of colonisation, and ensuring the equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms by First Peoples. The treaty does not, however, guarantee First Peoples' self-determination. The institutions it creates could be repealed at any time, but they do show the potential for government to work more effectively by ensuring First Peoples have a say in setting policy agendas. Unlike Te Tiriti o Waitangi in New Zealand, the Victorian Agreement occurs more than 200 years into the colonial project. But it is an example of democratic flexibility. It responds to the idea that democracy's purpose is not to exclude, but to find fair and reasonable ways of bringing different voices into the decision-making process. Important because citizenship's concern is for who belongs and who does not. Its primary purpose is not to tell us what services we should expect from the state, but to tell us who has a voice in deciding what the state is exactly. Citizens decide what the state does and what it leaves for others. For example, what it leaves for First Peoples. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, the government formed in 2023 is systematically undermining Te Tiriti's influence in public life and confronting its counter-colonial intent. It has also stopped work on the Declaration's implementation. Canada's approach is different again, and I'll come to that later. The Declaration was developed and negotiated through the UN system over 25 years. Developed and negotiated by Indigenous peoples from all parts of the world, and is the most comprehensive body of collective Indigenous political thought ever, giving international authority to the claim to self-determination as a collective and indispensable human right. Its 46 articles cover cultural, linguistic, social, economic and political rights, in policy domains as diverse as broadcasting, health, education, the care and protection of children, economic development, and resource rights. Culture is established as a fundamental human right, with implications for the language of instruction and schooling, the protection of land for both religious and economic purposes, and the operations of criminal justice systems, for example. In short, the Declaration is concerned with freedom. Like the liberal state, it is concerned with the circumstances where liberty may be enjoyed and the circumstances in which liberty is fairly or unfairly curtailed. Contemplating liberty might indeed begin with the right to culture, not a special or privileged right of Indigenous peoples, but a right that belongs to everybody. It is an important and overarching political right because culture helps to frame people's expectations of citizenship and of what it means to be a free and politically equal person. This is why Article 18 of the Declaration provides that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. Article 18 is simple, though far-reaching, insisting that Indigenous people, and by extension their cultural values, ought not be deliberately and systematically excluded from meaningful decision-making. While the Declaration does not prescribe the form that Indigenous inclusion should take, the presumption that inclusion should always and everywhere occur, if that is the Indigenous wish, is significant. The idea that Indigenous ways of being human are legitimately reflected in state law and policy complements a First Nations argument in Canada that the Declaration imposes a responsibility to live up to the concept of being a self-determining human. It is a new way to reform and empower our traditions and versions of humanity. In New Zealand, the Māori legal scholar Carwyn Jones proposes 5 principles of Māori constitutionalism that would reflect distinctive Māori influence in public decision-making. Whanaungatanga, the centrality of relationships to Māori life. Manaakitanga, nurturing relationships, looking after people and being very careful how others are treated. Mana, the importance of spirituality, sanctioned authority, and the limits on Māori leadership. Tapu and Noa, respect for the spiritual character of all things. Utu, the principle of balance and reciprocity. One may therefore see self-determination as a claim to political space. Specifically, the space, as Nussbaum puts it, to function well if one so chooses. So rather than being subservient to those of the state, Indigenous political philosophies might legitimately influence public affairs. Indigenous pedagogies might reasonably influence Indigenous schooling. Indigenous perspectives might reasonably be heard and hold influence wherever public policy is made and implemented. Perhaps then there are ways that the Declaration would support forms of political authority much greater in scope than what Watson and Vennie call Aboriginal management of white political space. Perhaps one can think further to contemplate forms of political decision-making where Indigenous deliberation involves white political space, making way for a national political space, a true commonwealth in which Indigenous peoples participate as Indigenous, participate as themselves. If, for example, Indigenous persons are peoples and thus entitled to collective recognition, perhaps there is also a right to a meaningful share in public sovereignty. Perhaps to allow Indigenous people to think of the contemporary state not as a Leviathan-like entity, but as a body structured on the presumption that all, and not just some people, share sovereign public authority. It is from sovereignty's character, shape and form that self-determination flows. Self-determination comes from the political values and institutional structures that determine where power lies, the values that influence the nature of one's belonging to a political community, the values that influence one's opportunities for distinctive citizenship. Participating in public affairs according to values and processes that make cultural sense. Colonialism is an ongoing process. The Declaration aims to circumvent it. Colonialism is a process involving the gradual and continuing phenomenon of settler populations asserting relative power vis-à-vis the Indigenous, which occurs principally through land alienation and cultural marginalisation. Antitheses of a non-dominant, non-colonial or post-colonial political order, supported by a view of sovereignty as an authority extending over and above Indigenous people. One could instead view sovereignty as an authority that comes from the people and which governments exercise on the people's behalf and for the common good. If this occurs on behalf of all and not just some people, one can imagine a different kind of politics and turn to the Declaration for guidance on how that politics might be practiced. Even the all-powerful sovereign of Hobbes's Leviathan exercised an authority for the people's collective benefit. Although he did not include Indigenous peoples in his account of public authority, he used their societies to contrast political order with what he called the state of nature. It remains that if one accepts equal citizenship as a just ambition, Hobbes's description of the limits of sovereignty is instructive. Sovereignty, he said, is an authority that can be withdrawn if it is not exercised for the people's collective benefit. The Leviathan's sovereignty is indivisible and for the time being absolute, but it is not forever unconditional. Hobbes allowed sovereignty to reside in an assembly and for the individual to retain liberty over things that cannot be transferred to the Commonwealth. The sovereign rules for all, not for itself. Sovereignty is only valid when it is given freely by the Commonwealth and exercises protection as its specific purpose. Thus, Hobbes said, a Commonwealth is not simply a vesting of sovereignty in a person or assembly, but a forging of unity. A non-colonial or post-colonial political order would mean that Indigenous peoples are free to live according to their own cultural values, manage their own affairs, and enjoy the land and resource rights that the Declaration promises. They would be positioned to develop just terms of association with the state. Terms of association where, for example, the state accepts that exercising powers of domination over Indigenous peoples is unjust, and that serious attempts must be made at restitution for the deprivation of lands, cultures, and political authority. In Australia, further treaties may provide the context for working out just terms of association. Their substance may differ from nation to nation, but at the very least, the Declaration gives international authority to the idea that these terms of association should in fact be just, because, as Noel Pearson put it, Aboriginal policy will never prosper if the Leviathan is not restrained in its cage and self-determining humans seeking a better life are not once again free to roam the continent. The terms of association between Indigenous peoples and the state may be just when both independent Indigenous institutions and state institutions support Indigenous peoples' capacities to make decisions over their own affairs without interference from the state, and when state institutions like schools, hospitals, and policy-making agencies accept Indigenous peoples' participation as themselves. An alternative is to deny that the right to self-determination is inherently bound in culture, and to assume instead that when people go to school or when they go to hospital, that they do so as cultureless beings. It is to assume that these institutions operate from positions of cultural neutrality. Another perspective is that culture is relevant, but that it is exclusively the culture of the post-settler population that properly determines the values under which public institutions operate. In this way, the Indigenous person's access to equal schooling or equal healthcare depends on their willingness and ability to assimilate into the settler culture, to think and understand the world only in terms that make sense in a culture that is not one's own. If sovereignty is the people's collective authority, it exists in symbiotic relationship with citizenship, the process through which one's share in public sovereignty acquires substantive political meaning, not simply as the right to vote or receive a welfare pension, but as the capacity to help shape the society in which one lives. The ways one belongs or does not belong to a political community is an expression of citizenship. So too are the ways that one is part of or excluded from the sovereign. As the embodiment of political capacities, citizenship is an ideological and power-laden concept that can exacerbate, exaggerate, or mediate tensions over the distribution of power and authority. Citizenship reflects the ways people are positioned in the political community, how they are positioned in relation to its institutions of power. For Indigenous peoples, it determines whether they are willing to see the state as ours, an inclusive institution, or as theirs, or as their exclusive and colonial construct. Contemporary colonialism means that in practice, Indigenous peoples may not routinely or ever experience citizenship as the substantive and important political concept that Aristotle once described. For Aristotle, the citizen is simply one who deliberates. Deliberating equally means that each member of a society has the same opportunity for meaningful influence on public affairs. And as the Declaration proposes, citizenship and its capacities belong to Indigenous people as to any people. That is, they belong inherently. They are not granted by the state's benevolence, nor are they achieved by negotiation. Te Tere Te Waitangi calls this tikanga ri te tahi, absolute equality of people and culture. Citizenship strength is measured by the extent to which people are inclined to use its capacities and what Kimlicka and Norman call their desire to participate in the political process, to promote the public good and hold political authorities accountable. Therefore, it is democratically important for Indigenous people to see the state as belonging to them and membership of the state as something worthwhile and capable of contributing to their capacity for self-determination. Unless Indigenous people find that this is their common experience, self-determination is elusive. What Maaka and Fleras call belonging together differently is possible when the terms of association between Indigenous peoples and other citizens and between Indigenous peoples and the state are grounded in what Fraser calls a politics of participatory parity. She says that participatory parity has two conditions. First, the distribution of material resources must be such as to ensure participants' independence and voice. The second condition requires that institutionalised patterns of cultural value express equal respect for all participants and ensure equal opportunity for achieving social parity. Participatory parity means that Indigenous people may contribute to public affairs with reference to colonial experiences and from their own cultural perspectives. They need not express their arguments through the language and values of the majority population, for to insist on this approach to political participation would be to make Indigenous culture a democratic disability, an obstacle to equal and meaningful participation. Measures like the guaranteed Māori seats in the New Zealand Parliament are examples of participatory parity, a form of democratic politics assuming that inclusive processes of public reason will inform public decision-making. Similar intent may be read into Victoria's treaty. Public reason is the assumption that to deliberate properly, people must give reasons for their views. They must expose them to informed scrutiny. Poorly thought out opinions or a refusal to entertain that another may have a reasoned, even if different, view does not allow democracy to work to its potential. It does not allow Indigenous people to defend their priorities and aspirations to an audience that is attentive, respectful, and open to the possibility of modifying its own positions. When there is no scope for the public reason that participatory parity imagines, Indigenous people are unable to scrutinise the opinions of others or argue for the unreasonableness of discriminatory positions. Public reason means that people must deal with disagreement with serious and well-informed argument. Rash opinions are unreasonable because they disregard another's right to be heard and considered. This is important because political values and procedures are not neutral. They are key determinants of political outcomes. The things that people value and the aspirations they hold influence the acceptability of any policy proposal. The processes that are used to make decisions are variables that influence people's capacity to participate and thus influence the moral acceptability of the decision itself. Culture cannot be kept from public life because political values themselves are deeply rooted in human culture. Canada, British Columbia and Vancouver City have committed to implement the Declaration. Canada passed legislation in 2021. Its purpose is to affirm the Declaration as a universal, international human rights instrument with application in Canadian law. The Act requires the government to take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration. Prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the Declaration's objectives. Table an annual report on progress to align the laws of Canada and the action plan. The Act provides for the action plan to include measures to address injustices, combat prejudices, and eliminate all forms of violence and discrimination against Indigenous peoples, including elders, youth, children, persons with disabilities, women, men, and gender diverse and two-spirit persons. To promote mutual respect and understanding, as well as good relations, including through human rights education. Related to the monitoring, oversight, follow-up, course or remedy, or other accountability with respect to the implementation of the Declaration. The first of these action plan points could be covered by general human rights legislation. It does not attend to the specific circumstances of indigeneity or colonisation, and does not, for example, note culture and prior occupancy as contexts where discrimination against Indigenous peoples may occur. Respect, understanding and good relations cannot be legislated, but are the product of political values. The third objective can only derive substance through specificity. Significantly, there is no mention of prior occupancy's ongoing rights and what these might mean in practical and contemporary terms. This could be yet another Canadian overstatement of its commitment to human rights, to Indigenous rights, though, in contrast, the commitment to ensure that all Canadian legislation is consistent with the Declaration is potentially transformative and instructive for jurisdictions like Australia. The Declaration is contested and complicated, but it is important because it is the world's most comprehensive body of Indigenous political thought and has the authority of the UN General Assembly, which makes Australia more broadly, and New Zealand, international outliers in how they think about the instrument and the rights and capacities of self-determination. Nevertheless, the Declaration provides a framework for evaluating how well other instruments, policies or bodies of thought inhibit or contribute to the rights and capacities of self-determination. A framework for evaluating the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example. The goals are supposed to leave nobody behind, yet their 232 indicators make just 2 references to Indigenous peoples. The first describes the right to subsistence farming. The second says that, as vulnerable people, They are entitled to the education system's special attention. Vulnerability is agency's opposite, yet agency is self-determination's essential presumption. The indicators recasting with reference to the Declaration may give context, coherence, and meaning to leaving nobody behind, embodying a series of human rights that cannot be found in small-scale farming alone, or as the subject of somebody else's concern for the vulnerable. One needs broader conceptions of justice and political possibility. Indeed, the human right to development requires explicit Indigenous leadership and participation across all 17 goals. Yet nowhere do the goals presume Indigenous leadership and participation. The Declaration, however, makes these preliminary to all people taking their places among those who are not left behind. On the other hand, Goal 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions, provides a useful starting point for thinking about the constituents and determinants of agency. What, for example, does a just and strong system of land tenure look like? By whom and for whom is it designed? Does it support livelihoods beyond subsistence? What, furthermore, makes a school just and strong? Is it, for example, equipped to support no poverty? Is it equipped to help people respond to the poverty of land alienation, linguistic deprivation, and the separation of families? These are political questions about the distribution of power, authority, and responsibility. Political questions about who is left behind and who is not. Who does what, how, for whom, and why. Questions of agency as the inherent expression of human dignity. Article 20 of the Declaration emphasises development through Indigenous peoples' own institutions. Development is neither small scale nor primarily a response to vulnerability. One finds in the right to development the essential characteristics of peace, justice, and strong institutions, and the explicit presumption that continuous development, not subsistence, is a reasonable human aspiration. Article 29 reinforces aspiration and agency through the Indigenous right to protect the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources. Zero poverty and zero hunger are therefore not the product of states acting justly to Indigenous peoples. They are the product of a secure Indigenous capacity to do justice to themselves. As Yesno put it in Canada, my hope is not my grandmother and her friends can get food subsidies so the grocery store is more affordable. My ultimate hope is that she has access to food, land and water shared amongst our community so she doesn't have to go to the grocery store at all. Article 32 reasonably encompasses authority over the means of production and sustenance, derived from what the Declaration calls a people's right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources. This may also mean the right to access and participate in properly functioning markets, uncompromised by poverty or restrictions on people's ability to use and develop resources for material well-being. Restricted because they have been alienated or compromised by other people's land management values. Wealthy liberal democracies like Australia, Canada and New Zealand tend to see the goals as a policy framework to help poorer countries increase their wealth. Members of the last Australian government went so far as to say that Australia already fully realised the goals and provided a gold standard for others to follow. However, leaving nobody behind is a universal ambition, and the Declaration reminds us how and why. It is intended to enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and Indigenous peoples, based on principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination and good faith. But to develop these principles into practical public policy, we might ask, in Tully's words, what recourses exist and political theory for thinking about the possibilities of a non-colonial relation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. My book, Indigeneity, Culture and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, considers this question with reference to theories of liberal democracy and citizenship. Framed by Indigenous agency and aspiration, I propose new indicators for each of the 17 goals. These are framed too in a people's right to do justice to itself, in its own ways and for its own reasons. A right that I read into the Declaration and explained in my book, We Are All Here to Stay, Citizenship, Sovereignty, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The idea that we are here to stay as Indigenous means that one needs to think about the state as the site of all, and not just some people's agency and authority. Indigenous peoples need the agency to influence the state as defender of all, and not just some people's independence and freedom. Liberal democracy can and does exclude some people, perhaps as a majority population's way of protecting its self-interest over the rights of others. However, this outcome is the product of human choice. It is not inherent to liberal democracy itself. The Declaration shows how and why. And Goal 16 raises the simple but far-reaching question, what does a just state institution look like? Ultimately, a just institution is designed to work equally well for everyone. It has every chance of working in this way because everyone has helped to design its decision-making processes. Everybody participates with the same realistic expectation of influence because participation occurs in ways that make cultural sense. Fraser's participatory parity, for example. Participatory parity shows that difference in public life is not strange or dangerous. One should expect it and admit that liberal democracy was intended to manage, not suppress difference, to recognise that, as Salmond put it, there are reasonable people who reason differently. As a just institution, the state might recognise the limits of its own authority. The Indigenous person's citizenship is therefore differentiated so that substantive and meaningful participation in the state complements and supports substantive and meaningful participation in the Indigenous nation's authority to make its own decisions over its own affairs. Maaka and Fleras call this approach to liberal citizenship one that presumes relative yet relational autonomy between peoples, each of which is autonomous in their jurisdiction. Differentiated citizenship recognises that the liberal sovereign is not a single person or entity residing indissolubly in one place. Sovereignty is widely dispersed, movable, and changeable. It belongs in practice to those who are present. Deciding when one should be present inside the state or inside the Indigenous nation, or both at the same time, requires a framework for establishing which authorities and responsibilities lie where. The Declaration contributes. The SDGs do not. But they could contribute, perhaps through new indicators like Indigenous nations and people are free from discrimination and unconstrained by states in determining and leading lives of personal value. That Indigenous nations freely maintain and develop their own institutions to support the greatest possible desired political, economic, social and cultural independence. That Indigenous nations engage with the state through just terms of association that they have freely helped to establish, and that Indigenous people help to design, maintain and develop public institutions with participatory parity and with the reasonable expectation that these institutions serve Indigenous interests as effectively as they serve other citizens. My overarching point is that Indigenous voice matters wherever public decisions are made. Voice belongs to all people inherently. It is not the gift of a kindly disposed state. These are the Declaration's founding presumptions, developed from aspirations to substantive policies and political arrangements through the choices we make about the meanings of citizenship and sovereignty and the privileging of agency over vulnerability. Kia ora hui tātou katoa, nau mai hoki mai sina e tino koa hau nā tōna hokinga mai. Kia ora everybody, and thank you very much for coming tonight.